If you haven't already, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat where you're located and the organization that you're based in. So welcome everyone to the Data Visualization webinar hosted by the Institute for Malaria and Climate Solutions. My name is Grace Kim, and I'm the manager for network partnerships at Malaria No More. The Institute for Malaria and Climate Solutions, IMACS, is a virtual center of excellence advancing the discipline of climate-informed infectious disease control and elimination, with an emphasis on malaria and other climate-sensitive infectious diseases. Our three pillars of action are innovation, knowledge dissemination, and implementation support. And one way that IMACS executes these pillars is by bringing together experts in malaria, other infectious diseases, climate, technology, and data into a global network to share our approaches to early warning systems and other prediction and planning models. Today, we're fortunate to have Jonathan Drummey from PATH to share strategies for how these tools can be better adapted for the end user. Jonathan is a data visualization specialist at PATH, where he provides technical assistance, training, and capacity building in data wrangling and data visualization in support of PATH's mission to improve global health. He focuses on developing new approaches to strengthening analytical skills and effective data use. And he also has prior experience as the lead trainer and consultant at DataBlick and as a volunteer on the Visualize No Malaria partnership that includes PATH, Tableau, Alteryx, Exasol, and the Zambia Ministry of Health. So welcome, Jonathan, and over to you to lead us through the webinar.
All right. Thank you, Grace. Welcome everybody in whatever time zone you're in. And today we're going to start out with, besides the introducing yourself in the chat, just a couple of Menti questions. And I'll paste the link in here in the chat as well, in case you haven't used it already. And this is a way to find out a little bit more about your experience with data visualization and presenting data. Excuse me. So I'll just give a moment for that. And while we're doing that, just to talk a little bit about PATH, we are an NGO with about 1,500 staff working in 40-odd different countries to eliminate health inequities. So about 60% of our staff is in the countries that we're serving and about 40% in the US. And we work in vaccines, drug development, device development, and health system strengthening, which is what we'll be talking about today in terms of effective use of data. And now I'm going to switch over to our Menti and take a look and see what people have had for instruction in chart types. So here, a lot of people with instruction in kind of the basic charts, pies, bars, lines, basic stats for histograms. And then as we move into more advanced statistics, the numbers go down. And only 2 people for pre-attentive attributes, which I will talk about today. Excuse me for 1 second. I'm going to mute myself so I can cough. All right, so this was the first question here, and then there was the follow-on question getting into what we'll be talking about today, of what kinds of data presentation have you had instruction in. And I can see that all these numbers are smaller than our previous chart where we had 10 or 11 responses maximum. So there's less formal instruction in this. And then as we move into interactivity and more complex charts, we have fewer and fewer people have those kind of skills. So hopefully we're going to level up your skills today somewhat and give you some places to learn more. So that's today's goal. And for me, in thinking about useful data visualizations, those are visualizations that I am using on a regular basis in support of my work or my life. And one of them that I use on a regular basis is the one on my watch, which is showing my level of activity in the day and how many calories have I burned, how many minutes of exercise have I gotten, and so on. And that as a visualization is something I can look at it at a glance and then see how I'm doing and have some encouragement to do more, because there's kind of a target goal here of closing your rings. So our dream as people who are creators of data visualizations for other people to use is that they will actually use them. And so we want to find ways to make that happen. And I want to be clear here, the guidance I'm providing today is really applicable to any tool. So whether you're R or Python or building visualizations in D3 or high charts or using tools like Power BI or Tableau or Excel, this all works for any of those. So in talking with Kaushik and others about kind of this audience and where you're starting from, my understanding is a lot of you are researchers and modelers who are moving into more data sharing and more data use. So one way to think of a traditional workflow is that we've got some level of definition and planning going on, then we collect our data, and once we have it, then we're cleaning it, preparing that data for analytical use, actually doing that analysis and reporting, and then we're sharing that out. And that might get shared out as a research paper, as a poster, a presentation, or maybe we're sharing a data set along with somebody else. Now, in this kind of state, this is very often a manual process that's infrequently run, like once a quarter, maybe once for the project. We're typically generating static outputs, and our audiences are very often peers, other researchers and modelers and so on. And in the goal of putting climate data to use for diseases, in that future state, we want to get to more automated pipelines where we're generating things daily, monthly, maybe even as real time as we can get. The visualizations being interactive and then serving a variety of different audiences. And that's where we can run into challenges with these different audiences. So we have a number of different types of audiences that we might reach out, and I have another Menti on that, which I'll paste in right now. So it might be the audiences we talk about, like researchers and modelers and so on. Maybe we're working with staff from a ministry or a donor or other NGO who are more data analyst types. Clinicians that we're working with, and people can be combinations of the above. Frontline workers, managers and directors of healthcare, and then at different levels. So whether that's facility, district, provincial, national, then there's the people in our community that we may be interacting with. So the visualizations we build maybe get presented to a member of parliament at some point. And then there's donors and the actual members of the communities that we're serving with our data. So all different kinds of audiences. And switching over, we will take a look at the Menti results and see what we have. So as people are entering here, we can see it's the whole cross-section of results that people are trying to reach with data. So with that, there's characteristics of these audiences that are different. And we're going to be speaking to that so we can make effective data visualizations for them. So what makes us give attention to a data visualization? I think of this as three things. So one of them, that first glance, we want it to be eye-catching. So here's a visualization we built for presentation. It's in black. Black is often sexy, looks really great when we're presenting it in a dark room. And then we have malaria cases as a red to gold kind of scheme here. So they pop on the screen and let us see what's going on. We want the data to be relevant to our audience. So numbers and variables that they care about. And then we want it to be apprehensible. And so by this, I mean that people can understand what's in the data. And particularly as we're talking different audiences, if we're presenting to a community health worker who maybe has a high school education, we're not going to be able to give them the same visualization that we would be able to give to somebody who has a PhD in malaria modeling. So this is all stuff that makes us give attention to it. But the thing that we really care about as we're building our visualizations is that people are putting them to use, that they are using these visualizations involving climate data, involving case incidence data, and so on in their daily work. And this changes the priorities here. So first of all, it does need to be relevant and it needs to be apprehensible. And the data also needs to be actionable in some way. So when we see this visualization, what are we going to do? And then a fourth piece of this, which isn't so much under our control, but it is something that is necessary, is that we're willing to change what we do when we see the data. So there's times I've worked with organizations that they want fancy new visualizations, but ultimately they're not changing their decisions and their processes in how they do that. And in that case, that time we try to put into the fancy new visualizations isn't useful for that. And then in this case, the eye-catching is nice to have, but it's not really necessary for the visualizations. So that visualization on my watch really works. It's relevant to me. I care about my health and how much, as somebody with a desk job, how much am I really getting out? I can quickly understand it. As I see it, I can be like, okay, yes, I will take a break and take a walk, and so on. So I'm going to give an example of this, not less need for eye-catching right now. And a few years ago, I was in 2019, I was at this data visualization conference, and big stadium full of thousands of people. And the regional data officer for Nissan North America, so Nissan Motors cars, was presenting and threw up a bunch of visualizations on the screen that are, when I look at them, I'm like, these are not really eye-catching visualizations to me. Like, they're not showing me off, but this is what had value to the folks at Nissan for them to present on this screen. And as I was in the audience for this presentation, there were a couple of people behind me who work for Daimler-Benz, so makers of Mercedes and other cars. And I heard them whispering to each other, like going, ooh, look at that, because these visualizations were relevant and appropriate to that audience of people who work in auto manufacturing. So it's a place of, we don't necessarily need the pretty, we need the good data. So now I want to talk about us. So who is us? And that is our audience. So who are the people we are trying to reach? And the biggest takeaway from this, and if there's one takeaway you can get from this whole presentation, it would be that it's not about you and what you want to tell when you're making a visualization. It's about your audience. It's about what they want, what they need. So the audience may say that they want a visualization that has a predictive analytic of malaria incidents, for example. Like, that's where they want to go. And this is something we ran into with Malaria No More in the Forecasting Healthy Futures project, was that there was a whole need to do data integration and do data quality work before we could get to what the audience wanted. So we needed to satisfy both, to talk about, okay, what are reporting rates? What are completion rates? How good is this data? to get to that point of the predictive analytics that people were also interested in. So it's a change of viewpoint. And when we're coming from a more traditional researcher kind of standpoint where we're publishing papers, we're often more in that place of, okay, here's my research, I need to share it with the audience. And to get that data use to increase, I'm encouraging you to put yourself in your audience's shoes. So with that, how do we get there? So to get to that relevant, apprehensible, and actionable visualization. And my shorthand for this is thinking about, we want to give our audience the right data at the right level of detail at the right time in the right format that's going to support their right action. And we're going to spend most of the rest of the presentation going into these in detail. And then we will have, I'm sorry, I didn't mention about questions. Feel free to ask questions, and we'll answer them at the end. So in thinking about right data, and my, okay, this was working differently. So to walk through this table, the animations aren't working as I expected. We have attributes that our audience cares about. So they might be thinking about, or the data you might have might be something like predicted increase in malaria parasite distribution. And yet what the audience really cares about is, okay, well, how's that going to change the distribution of cases that we have, and how many more severe cases are we going to get out of that? Or as a more basic thing, are we showing raw numbers versus absolute change versus a percentage change is a common one. That our attribute names and values have meaning for our audience. So the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is a giant donor in public health, and at least at Path, depending on who you talk to, they might get called the foundation. But my first day at Path, I was like, okay, what's the foundation kind of thing? So making sure we're using names that have meaning to our audience. The level of data quality and accuracy. So how big a deal is it that we may be missing some data, or if there can be errors in the data, what's an acceptable error rate? So for example, I was working on some project management data around budgeting, and I found the project teams they needed those numbers to be exact and to be able to explain every variance. Whereas the finance people who are working with larger data sets, they have a better understanding of the data, they were accepting a higher error rate in the data. And then the appropriate level of security and access control, always need to think about that. So now talking about right level of detail, we have another Menti that we're going to be doing, talking about aggregation. And so when we have data, we may get data at an individual level, or when it comes to, let's say, a spatial data set of rainfall data that might be at the kilometer or 5 kilometer grid, and yet we need to aggregate that up to the district level or provincial level, or identify what is the rainfall or temperature around a facility. So we're generally aggregating data in certain ways. And I have an example of aggregation in the Menti. So if you're presenting incidence predictions to provincial staff for appropriate resource allocation, what level should your data be at? As a question, should that be at the national level? Should it be at the provincial level? Should it be at the district level, sub-district, or it depends? And got a couple of votes coming in here. And we'll give this Another 30 seconds or so for votes. Oh, thank you, Grace. And somebody typing in another vote for district in the chat. So for the people who are voting for district, I'm guessing what you're thinking about is that when we're thinking about positioning resources, we don't just want to drop people and materials in the province. We want to be able to target them more appropriately. So in that case, going to a sub-level of that provincial level makes sense. So going to the district. And then on the it depends side is that maybe there's a whole lot of districts and there's just too many districts to do that. So we need to aggregate it up to something higher potentially, or too many sub-districts or so on, where we're thinking about who our audience is and what kind of aggregation works for them. So another piece of aggregation is thinking about the level of detail of the data that we want to show. And here I have an example where we have, these are examination rates for patients with diabetes, for their eyes and feet, for blindness and neuropathy. And we have the rates in green and the targets in gray. So there's basically 8 numbers we're displaying on this visualization, and it doesn't tell us much about what are the individual practitioners doing with this data. So another way we can do that is to think about to actually show a lot more numbers. So here we have a circle for each of the physicians in the practice. So this is called a strip chart or strip plot in some cases. So it's like a one-dimensional scatter plot is another way to think about this. And so we have each of our practitioners here and what their rate is. And then we have the blue line being the targets and the black reference line here being that overall rate. So we can see that distribution and see it's quite a bit different between with eye examination and family practice. That distribution is kind of roughly even with a few outliers here. Whereas internal medicine, it's much more stacked. Many more of the practitioners are above the target, and then there's only 5 or so who are below our target. And so the interventions we would do change based on this, and ultimately this visualization can potentially be more actionable. So that's another piece of aggregation to think about. Then we have some other pieces of this are what is the amount of precision in our data? And in a lot of cases, we don't need to show lots of decimal places, or we don't need to show every single age group that we're working with here. We may need to show uncertainty with our audiences as well, and how they're doing it. In terms of the context and supporting data, what do people need as far as supporting data to appropriately interpret this chart? So it's very common for us to do, okay, what were things previously? So having some sort of benchmark or baseline, or maybe it's more in that orientation to where do we want to go? So what is our target? We need to provide more lineage and attribution of the data for people. And then having affordances as a user interface design term for the things that aren't what's in front of us, but that help us get there. So having the right titles and text and access labels and so on, potentially including variable definitions within the visualizations that we build or supporting materials. So it all gets to the right level of detail. Now, going on to right time, there's the timeliness of our data. And there's various ways we can think of that. So one way is if we have data that's being gathered annually, how long after the end of the year is that available? Is that January, February, or we'd have to wait 6 months? When do we get yesterday's data available? What do we do with in-process data versus maybe we have to wait for the reporting month to complete for that to be useful because everybody waits until the last day to get their data in. How much time does it require to take in and interpret the visualization? So for example, I'm presenting to you today and flipping through different things at a certain speed, so that is fixed. Whereas if you're reading the presentation later on, you can take as much time as you need. And then another example of this comes from the local healthcare system that I worked with several years ago. And where a number of the visualizations I was building were for clinicians. They were for doctors and nurses. And their job is to see patients. And one of the things I quickly realized was that nobody got into medicine to look at my dashboard. Their job is to, like I said, to take care of patients. And to the degree that they're taking time out of their day to look at the visualization I've created, I need to be really careful of their time and make sure they can find information quickly, that it's meaningful, and that it's actionable for them. There's also how often are people seeing the data? So we might have facility staff who are working with the data every day and they know it really well, whereas there might be like a board or you're presenting to a government official who's looking at this data once per year. And in that case, we can't just launch into the data like they knew it. We need to load them up with the appropriate context and so on so they can understand it. And then there's this piece around phase of data use. And I'm just going to jump to some other slides here to explain, to do this. So we think of these three phases of data use. And the first phase is expose. And this is where we're first getting our hands on what is in the data, trying to link the data to other data sets. What is the quality of the data and so on. And for that, we can run into some different things. So here's a visualization that we built on one of our projects where we had different structure counts. This was for indoor residual spray for malaria. And depending on who the source of the data was, they gave us different numbers. And we needed to look at that before we could go on and say, okay, what is the percentage of structures we actually sprayed? Doing data quality reviews for timeliness, completeness, and accuracy with our data is another thing. And then as we have that basic handle on the data, then we can start exploring the data and understanding, okay, what is the variation in this data? What does it have to tell us? And this is where we'll get that kind of typical exploratory dashboard that has a bunch of filters down the right for choosing what level we want or what indicators we want, time periods, and so on for that data. Another case in this is where we can, once we've got all that data integrated, let's see it all together into one place. So here's a visualization we built that was integrating indoor residual spray data and entomological data and case and incidence data all in one place. So doing that as an exploration. Another piece of exploration gets into the grain of the data that we're working with. We may want to go down to a very, very fine grain. So here, the individual little shapes on here are individual homes and structures that had been identified by a combination of satellite and ground truthing. With that, and maybe that's useful in some cases, or maybe we want to aggregate up higher and look at things at a facility level or spray area level or so on. Then after the third phase is where we understand the data well enough that we can either retrospectively explain why things the way they are, or get into the predictive modeling as well. And so in talking about these phases, they change what we can do with the data. And we can't really get, all of you who do machine learning and so on, no, you can't do machine learning unless you have good data and you know what features you want to use. And so that's where we have a bit of a progression of moving through expose and explore to get to explain. But ultimately, we're using all of those for our users. And a couple examples here. This was a visualization looking at impact of indoor residual spray. This is a visualization with individual data for doing contact tracing. And then here's another dashboard we built that was helping to identify, okay, what community health workers were in areas that had higher incidence rates that we would do a secondary round of indoor residual spray for. So very actionable visualization that ultimately gets us to a list of, okay, who are we going to be working with? And ultimately, we're doing all of this, thinking about it in this way, so we can empower those users of our visualizations and give them what they need. So those are the three phases of data use. And talking about right time. And then the other piece I want to mention here, because oftentimes where your researchers and modelers, you are presenting data for the first time to your audiences, and there's emotional impact that goes with that data. And a colleague of mine adapted Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grief to data. And the 5 stages are denial. So those aren't my numbers. I'm sure we've heard that sometimes, and that's where somebody wants lots and lots of supporting context and lineage of the data and so on. There might be anger. Okay, who got those numbers? There's somebody responsible for this, and I am mad at them and want to punish them. Bargaining. So what if we, okay, let's take the numbers, and what if we smoothed it out and did a moving average or something like that with the data? Would that improve things in some way? Then getting into depression, like, why are we even bothering to do this? We're not going to change anything with this. And finally getting to that acceptance place of like, okay, this is what the data has to tell us. How can we get better? And I bring this up because I run into this again and again and again. And when I'm presenting new data sets to people for the first time, I'll think about my audience. How likely are they to be in this space? And so, for example, I was working with one group, and they basically pointed at every outlier in the data and launched into the explanation of why that was a special case and should not be included in the data. So they were totally in denial about that. And being able to recognize that, I could listen to them and then move on and include the numbers because they were real and things we cared about. So that's right time. Now let's talk about right format. So in the delivery method, like, this is a live presentation to you as an audience. I can't see you. So there's people popping up things in the chat here and there. So there's things that we want to think about when we're doing that, so we can effectively communicate with the data, like how big is our audience and how big is the room? What is the quality of the display that we're using? Because it's horrible to have a beautiful visualization that you've made in all shades of gray, and then you're presenting on a projector with a very dim lamp or bulb, and all those shades of gray become one mass of color that they can't distinguish things. And then with asynchronous, so that's where there's static outputs. When we're using paper, we can get 1200 dots per inch on paper. Displays are still running at 250 dots per inch max or so. So we can get much higher resolution on paper. Also, are we delivering something that's more of an exploratory visualization to somebody, or are we getting more into that explanatory place with them? with the visualization. So those all change what we're going to do. The other one I'm going to mention that happens all the time is font size. Is that when we're used to creating static displays for print or for somebody to read as a PDF, we can get away with really small font sizes. When we're presenting to an audience, we need to bump up our font size significantly. So the smallest font size I'm using today is 18 point in everything here to make it visible. If I'm putting visualizations on a screen, I'll often bump it up to 16 or 18 points kind of minimum, and I'll often go bigger to make it visible, because it's horrible to have somebody trying to read the numbers and they can't read the numbers. So I was talking about format. Now we're going to spend, I'm going to have to move a little faster here for time. Visualization supporting the questions being asked. So as an example of this, of what this matters, I'm going to flash something up on the screen for a few seconds, and I want you to count how many 9s are on the screen. Okay, so go ahead and put in the chat how many 9s you saw on the screen here. And 0 is an acceptable answer. 1 in the chat, none, 1. Oh, all right. Now I'm going to put it up on the screen, only I'm going to color the 9s in yellow. How many are there? 4. We get that instantly. I'm going to skip this Menti for time and just kind of explain it and walk through it. So we have this, this question of which chart is best for showing whether B, which is our orange variable here, increased from 2022 to 2023, and it provided a bunch of different charts. And I've seen all these charts in practice for this kind of question. And the best chart for, and I purposely did not label it. And for this question, the best chart is the line chart, because we can look at this and immediately see that line is not going up, it's going down from 2022 to 2023. Whereas in the group bars, we have to try to compare the lengths and jump back and forth. In the pie charts, we have to figure out the sizes, but there are different angles in doing this. In the stacked bars, they don't have the same baseline. It's harder to figure out. And to that point of like, why aren't there labels on it? If you have to show the number labels to make sense of a chart, it's probably not the right chart. For that, we want people to be able to understand the chart on its own. If they need to see all the numbers, maybe we need to show them in a table, for example. So there's this notion of pre-attentive attributes. These are things that are the visual cortex of our brain perceives before we have conscious attention. So that's the pre and the pre-attentive attributes. So things like length, width, position, orientation, the shape of something, the size and color and so on are all there. And what data visualization researchers have done is identified 4 different kinds of variables from top to bottom here. In general, what is fastest and most accurate for us to read, and what is slowest and least accurate for us to read. And then from that, we can go to, okay, what are questions we have of the data? And then in looking at that, identify what chart types work well for that question based upon the pre-attentive attributes. And I'm sharing out this presentation, so you'll have all this detail, and there'll be a set of other links as well. So when we're going back to this thing, this line chart is the one that is most directly using position and orientation to show whether B went up or down. Whereas the rest of these, position is being used to position B in different places, and it's length that's being used for B. And then we have essentially shape and area being used for B over here. So there's So that's why the line chart is best for this particular question. So that's supporting the question being asked. And we also want to match the data literacy level of our audience. So for example, showing population adjusted data versus not adjusted data, and things. So I'm going to give an example of this, kind of putting this all together for you. This came from an actual presentation by somebody with a PhD in modeling. And I'm protecting names and audience. And it was a presentation to a donor that I happened to be sitting in. So with that, they showed up a slide like this. And then they went to another slide like this, and it changed to 2015, and a couple of things changed. And then they said something like, as we can see, the incidence for Sinazongwe had a 60% year-over-year decline. And looking at this, you might be wondering, like, okay, where is Sinazongwe? Or why should I care about this? What did the incident start at? Where is it at now? So all these things that are part of that context of who is our audience and what do they know? We might be interested in, okay, what happened around that area? Or most likely we're going to be in that space of going, what? I missed it. So there's other ways we can do this same visualization. So here I took the two slides, put them side by side and circled Sinazongwe and provided some numbers for context. This took all of a couple of minutes and it's way easier to read. Oh, and I gave it a good title too. Or here, this is a laying out the data where we can have the numbers to compare back and forth. Here's that percentage change, and we've sorted it to put Sinazongwe at the top. Or here's another visualization with a title. We've put things on a log axis. So when we're using a log axis, the slope of the line is now the rate of change, and we can see Sinazongwe has pretty much the steepest change of anything. And then I've highlighted and labeled that. And these three charts took me about 20 odd minutes to put together as variations on that original presentation that make this statement much more understandable. Another piece thinking about data literacy of our audience. This was a slide of cumulative COVID tests in the United States presented at the White House. And Donald Trump looked at the slide and said, it's going up at a rapid rate. This is cumulative data, and Donald Trump is not a data visualization specialist. And so he totally reading the chart, and that's what it looks like. When we actually adjust that chart to the actual tests, we can see there's not really much change going on here when we look at the actual daily tests. So thinking about that, who's our audience and what do they need is really key. So the last piece here is that right action. So what is the audience going to do when they see this data? And it depends. Do they have, maybe they have enough knowledge to move on to the next question, which might be looking at another visualization. They have enough knowledge to make a decision or set up a meeting where they're going to talk with somebody else and get to that decision. Or maybe there's something physical that they can do to do that. We want to avoid that piece of they see the visualization, it goes in through their eyeballs and then leaks out the back of their brain. Where they're, that's interesting, and then it goes away. The other thing we want to avoid in most cases with visualization is that somebody says, okay, well, let me just download the data and analyze it myself. In that case, are there ways we can make their life, if we want them to be using the data in their daily work, very often we'll want to ask them those questions to find out what it is they want to do with that and build that visualization. So this is the full list of these. In terms of putting this information to use, I mean, just the last couple of slides here. I mentioned this is independent of tools. So you use what works for you and your audience in thinking about them and meeting their needs. And then for this bit, this is a slide full of text. Like these are topics we could spend hours and days on. So there's a lot of learning to go. Just to highlight the main bullets points, iteration is really key with this, that oftentimes the first thing somebody's going to say is not what they really need. So we want to have time to sit with them. And I find it's really useful if we just kind of talk about what people want. It's hard for them to see it. So taking that time to create a wireframe or mock-up, even drawing on paper, or working in tools like Figma or Canva to just demonstrate this, or as soon as I can get a minimum data set together, building some visualizations on it so they can start and go, okay, you're showing me absolute numbers. I want to see percentages, things like that. Then for each visualization or dashboard, a way I think about it, like going back to the watch example, is that we have this limited space that we're using for visualization, and everything that we're putting on that screen has to justify its existence there. So understanding why this visualization exists and what we're going to do with it is absolutely important. And that what I find is the visualization projects that just seem to get really stuck and going back and forth and nobody's really satisfied in it, have a case where either the purpose is unclear or there's too many purposes for the visualization. It needs to be broken up into different visualizations. So, and that also goes to who's the audience, because sometimes I get asked like, okay, well, we only have funding to build a dashboard, and that dashboard has to work for the facility staff, for the national level staff, and the donors. And those are three very different audiences with very different needs. That's going to be really hard to meet in one dashboard. So there's working with people on that. The other piece I will say, if you're working on data with you're working towards building dashboards, is this last one around, are the processes around the data and intended data use stable and defined? So for example, I was just in a call the other day where one of my favorite people I work with was like, hey, I've got this fresh new data, and then listed off and we want to build a dashboard for it. And then they listed off about 8 different questions, which were all kind of basic statistical questions. There was nothing there about like, okay, what do people really need to see out of this data? It's a fresh data set. What are they going to do with it? So they were really in that expose kind of phase with the data and not in that explain kind of phase with the data. And trying to build a dashboard right now, I'd build a chart for them, and then they'd be like, no, that's not what I want to see. And then we just be stuck in the cycle of iteration. So in there, supporting them to do that analysis, to understand the data, and then build the dashboard is where to go with that. And then when reviewing a visualization of dashboard, the thing that I'm looking for with people, I'm always trying to have them on a screen share or be with them in person. And I'm really looking at what they're doing. Is their mouse orbiting the screen like I'm doing right now? Are their eyes kind of looking around trying to find something? Or what's going on in their brain at that time? Because it might be they're looking, they're doing math in their heads, or they're trying to find some other number there. They need some other context to help get to that point. So to do that. So that's what I have for you today. You'll be getting the presentation. I have another list of resources that will hyperlinks that'll come along with that. And in our last few minutes here, I will leave it open to questions.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was a very helpful presentation. I'm sure a lot of the resources and questions and information in there is going to be helpful for a lot of folks on the call. As we're kicking off the Q&A section, feel free to drop your questions in the chat, and then we can get to them. I can kick it off just with a quick question on maybe an example of how the actionable piece is adapted to different audiences. At the beginning of the presentation, you had kind of listed out the different end users, and
Mhm.
I'm thinking, if there's the same data set on malaria case
Mhm.
data, how
Yep.
would you, adapt something like that to be usable by someone in the community or at a local
Mhm.
clinic versus
Yep.
someone at the ministry level who's
Okay.
making decisions on this? So what are some examples of what actionable data looks like at two different
Um,
levels?
whoops. Let me go back. Let me stop sharing here. So in thinking about that, um, one thing I often think about is um, like if let's say we're presenting to somebody at the ministry level, then often very times the higher up you go in the organization, the shorter someone's attention span gets. So I'm not going to show all the numbers with all the confidence intervals and all of that necessarily. I mean, if they're a physician or somebody with a degree in public health or something like that, maybe we do that. So it's figuring out what they need. And then what is it they need to support the project and move on. So in that case, I might be moving more into an explanatory visualization kind of thing where it's like, okay, I'm maybe instead of showing a map with all the districts, I'm highlighting in a ranked bar chart, okay, what are the districts that are the highest or lowest performing ones? Because maybe I want to call out the positive deviant outliers for what they're doing and say, we should get everybody to be like them, or maybe go the other way. Um, so how can I make it as quickly for them to take in the data and so on? Whereas let's say we're moving down the organizational hierarchy to somebody who's at a district level. So I've worked, for example, with district health information officers, and my interest might be malaria or HIV or something like that. But these are people who are doing a lot of different things. And in cases, they may be evaluating like, um, what's the story of malaria in our district or something like that, and need to put things together so that way they can do that. Or in some cases, um, they have regular presentations they're doing to other district health information officers or at a provincial level, and maybe I'm helping them build that presentation from the data to make it that the key that they need is if I can give them that slide that they can use every month, that they don't have to go off and download data and paste stuff into Excel and then put it in a PowerPoint and try to remember how to format it. If I can build that for them, then that works. Or maybe it's giving them the tools where they can dive into the facilities in their district and see, okay, like who's up, who's down. Maybe they need to be able to do some extra grouping and things, that there's some natural cohorts in the data that aren't in the data, but are in their head in terms of when were those facilities opened or what the skill level of the staff is. There's one of the things for me is that we often try to work with big data, or a lot of what is big data is easily consumable data, relatively easily. Like you got to know some stuff to be able to pull down vegetation index data and so on, and start manipulating it. But the data is there, you can work with it. But at the same time, there's all of this small data of, hey, this is a pattern of behavior in this particular facility that happens once a year. That the people who are closer to that front line of the organization know that. And this is where getting to know the audience can really help that piece.
Yeah, thanks for that. It's helpful to run through kind of a scenario like that with you.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a couple minutes left.
I have one more piece on that just to talk about as kind of
Sure.
a framing. I just had brought some extra slides. Let me share my screen again. This is kind of a thought in process for me around thinking about what we do with data as a network. So instead of like a linear pipeline for our data, that the systems, the people involved, the data products we're creating, the charts, the graphs, the papers, the dashboards, and so on, they're all nodes in this graph of data use. So that person, because ultimately we're trying to improve public health. So we're serving people. And there's data being collected about them that we are then using in different ways. How do we feed back to them and let them know about that data, and what is the progress of malaria control and elimination efforts, for example, in an area, or other neglected tropical diseases. When we're for that facility person who has that information about, okay, this facility or set of facilities is special and is different, how can that data flow upstream? So that way, when somebody's looking at it, they're like, oh my God, there's an outlier here, what's wrong? But there's actually an explanation for it that can be captured in the data, and doing that. So there's, so this piece about thinking about our audience, some of where this has led me to is that not just thinking about it as a one-way communication to the audience, but that it's really a two-way communication with my audience, that we need to make rich and robust.
Yeah, that's really helpful framing. I am seeing one more question, but in our last minute, it says, how can data be used for prediction models for malaria data, specifically in elimination? Jonathan, I don't know if you have the time in 1 minute to cover.
I am not a modeler or doing that, so I don't feel qualified to do that, but I think it's a great thing to hand over to Kaushik for last words, because that's what he's doing with forecasting healthy futures.
Yeah, I think it's a perfect transition. Kaushik, if you could briefly talk on that and wrap us up here in our last minute.
First of all, thank you, Jonathan. Incredible session. I think I have spoken with you for not less than 30-40 times so far. We had several meetings, but every time I speak with Jonathan or I hear from him, I learn something new. And I don't know where this ends, but I believe, is an ocean of information, especially in the field of data visualization. I really appreciate his time and energy to support and collaborate with us, and also especially in these capacity building processes and orientation sessions, where I believe that I shouldn't be too selfish enough to confine this knowledge and wisdom of Jonathan to myself, but it needs to percolate to the larger community that exists, and that would be benefited through your wisdom. So incredible session, Jonathan, and I really feel privileged to be part of this session. And I believe we can match, the quality of these kind of sessions in our future ones as well. So with that, thank you so much, Jonathan. Amol, to your question on the prediction model on malaria data, at IMACS, we are already planning to hold a webinar on the modeling part that would include the different types of models. And today we not only talk about the one single prediction model, because if you see the data science advancements, especially in other fields, for example, tsunami warning and other areas, people really are talking about model of models, where you automate and ensemble different models and generate greater wisdom from data. So stay tuned for this. We'll plan and let you all know what the next topic would be, but definitely we have kept modeling as one of the topics that we will cover in some of our future sessions. And it may not be completed in one session also, we may need more sessions. But all of these questions actually tell me today that how interesting these sessions can be and how exciting it would be for people to contribute to. We will continue in our endeavor, as you all know, and I think Grace has already talked about our entire initiative based on the 3 pillars of action. We are continuing to foster knowledge transfer and these kind of applied sessions so that everyone in their field, you'd be a program manager in health or a research officer, or if you are working in the implementation field, or you are working in a corporate in R&D, I believe everyone can actually get benefited from an applied session that looks into the details of what can be done and what are the do's and don'ts and what are the best practices that are available globally. So with that, I will conclude today's session, and I look forward to having any feedback from you. Stay tuned, and if any of you wish to have any more questions, please feel free to email Grace, and we will be very happy to respond to those questions. And Jonathan is a longtime friend and connect and our collaborator in these initiatives. So I believe we will be happy to fetch responses, and he will also be able to contribute more to with his wisdom. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for the next session. Thank you, Grace.